"Sir, this event is invitation only." The words stopped Marcus Reynolds just a few feet from the entrance of the most anticipated art auction in the city, and for a moment the crowd moving beneath the bright gallery lights continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Luxury cars lined the street. Photographers captured arriving guests. Collectors, investors, and celebrities stepped through the doors while attendants welcomed them with practiced smiles. Yet Marcus remained standing outside, facing a security coordinator holding a digital guest list. "I understand," Marcus said calmly. "Would you mind checking one more time?" The coordinator glanced at the tablet. His expression suggested the matter was already settled. "I already checked twice, sir. Your name is not on the list." Marcus nodded politely. "Then perhaps there is another registration under my company." The coordinator shook his head. "Without confirmation, I cannot let you inside." Around them, several guests slowed their pace just enough to observe the conversation before continuing toward the entrance. Nobody intervened. Nobody asked questions. They simply assumed the gallery staff knew what they were doing. Marcus looked through the glass doors into the main exhibition hall. Inside, hundreds of guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers. Rare paintings worth millions of dollars hung on carefully illuminated walls. Auction specialists moved through the crowd preparing for what industry publications had already called the most important sale of the year. Marcus smiled faintly. He had followed the preparations for months. In fact, he knew more about the gallery's financial situation than almost anyone attending the event. But he kept that information to himself. "Very well," he said. "I will wait." The coordinator appeared surprised. Most people denied entry, argued. They demanded managers. They complained. Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he stepped aside and sat on a stone bench near the entrance. The coordinator quickly returned his attention to arriving guests. Within minutes, the incident seemed forgotten by everyone except Marcus. From his seat, he observed the gallery with the patience of someone who had spent years studying organizations. The building itself was impressive. Historic architecture blended with modern renovations. The gallery projected sophistication, exclusivity, and influence. Yet Marcus had learned long ago that appearances often conceal deeper truths. A young couple approached the entrance carrying invitations. Staff members greeted them warmly and opened the doors immediately. Moments later, another guest arrived wearing an expensive designer suit. Employees rushed forward to assist him. Marcus watched every interaction. The pattern became obvious. People were not being evaluated based on who they were. They were being evaluated based on what they appeared to be. The distinction mattered. Across the street, evening traffic moved steadily through downtown. Office towers reflected the fading sunlight. Restaurants filled with customers beginning their night. The city felt alive, growing, changing. Marcus enjoyed watching cities evolve. Great cities depended on opportunity. Opportunity depended on access. And access often depended on the decisions made by institutions like the one standing in front of him. Several minutes passed. Through the glass, Marcus noticed Victoria Langford moving across the exhibition floor. As executive director of the gallery, she was impossible to miss. Elegant, confident, completely focused on the event. Staff members followed her from room to room as she finalized preparations. Guests greeted her enthusiastically. Industry reporters requested interviews. Tonight represented a major milestone for the gallery. The auction's success could shape its future for years. Yet Victoria never once looked toward the entrance. She had no reason to. As far as she knew, everything was proceeding perfectly. Marcus folded his hands and continued watching. A gallery employee stepped outside carrying event materials and briefly noticed him sitting near the entrance. The employee hesitated before speaking. "Are you waiting for someone?" Marcus smiled. "Not exactly." The employee seemed uncertain. "The auction begins soon." "I know." The employee nodded politely and returned inside. Once again, nobody asked his name. Once again, nobody questioned why he remained there. The assumption was simple. If he mattered, someone would recognize him. If nobody recognized him, he probably did not matter. Marcus found the logic fascinating. It appeared in every industry, every institution, every organization. People often confused visibility with importance. The mistake repeated itself endlessly. Inside the gallery, lights brightened as guests moved toward the main auction hall. Anticipation filled the building. Rare collections awaited bidding. Major investors prepared to compete for significant acquisitions. Reporters adjusted cameras. Staff members reviewed schedules. Everything appeared flawless. Yet Marcus knew something the crowd did not. Beneath the polished image and public confidence, the gallery stood on a financial foundation far more fragile than anyone realized. He checked his watch. 8 minutes had passed since he was denied entry. 8 quiet minutes. 8 ordinary minutes. The kind of minutes most people would forget immediately. Marcus looked toward the entrance once more and smiled to himself. Because sometimes the most important decisions in an organization's history begin with a simple assumption. And tonight, inside the gallery, thousands of people were about to learn exactly how expensive a wrong assumption could become. Inside the gallery, the atmosphere felt electric. Hundreds of invited guests filled the exhibition hall beneath carefully positioned lights designed to make every painting appear even more valuable than it already was. Conversations flowed between collectors, investors, museum representatives, and wealthy patrons who viewed tonight's auction as both a cultural event and a business opportunity. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. Camera crews prepared for coverage. Staff members moved efficiently through the crowd. To an outside observer, everything appeared flawless. Yet only a few feet beyond the entrance doors, Marcus Reynolds remained seated on the stone bench exactly where security had left him. He watched the event unfold through the glass with calm curiosity. Years of experience had taught him something important. The most revealing moments inside an organization often occur when nobody realizes they are being observed. Across the exhibition floor, Victoria Langford moved confidently between guests. As executive director, she had spent nearly a year organizing the auction. The event represented more than a fundraiser. It represented a public demonstration of the gallery's status. Every guest, every sponsor, every bidder contributed to an image of success that Victoria worked tirelessly to maintain. She greeted major donors by name. She posed for photographs. She discussed upcoming acquisitions with collectors. The evening was progressing exactly as planned. At least that was what she believed. Near the registration desk, 2 gallery employees reviewed attendance records. One glanced toward the entrance. There was a man denied entry earlier. The second employee barely looked up. Not on the list? Apparently not. The second employee shrugged. Then he was not supposed to be here. The conversation ended immediately. Nobody felt any reason to investigate further. The assumption seemed logical. Important people received invitations. Important people appeared on lists. Therefore, anyone missing from the list could not be important. The simplicity of that reasoning made it dangerous. Marcus had encountered it throughout his career. Years earlier, before building one of the country's fastest-growing technology companies, he had attended investment meetings where people assumed he was an assistant rather than a founder. He remembered conferences where organizers directed him towards service entrances because they assumed executives looked different. He remembered private events where recognition depended less on accomplishments and more on appearances. None of those experiences angered him anymore. They interested him, because assumptions revealed more about institutions than individuals. Through the gallery windows, Marcus observed guests gathering near the main stage where the auction would soon begin. Some discussed artwork. Others discussed business opportunities. Several spoke about market trends. Yet one topic surfaced repeatedly: money, the value of collections, the price of paintings, the influence of ownership. Marcus found the irony amusing. Inside, people celebrated wealth and ownership while remaining completely unaware of who sat outside. A few minutes later, a senior financial sponsor arrived unexpectedly. Staff members rushed toward him immediately. Doors opened. Handshakes followed. Multiple employees escorted him personally through the gallery. Marcus watched the scene unfold and smiled. The contrast could not have been clearer. Recognition created access. Access created importance, at least within the gallery's culture. Victoria noticed the arrival and quickly joined the group. Her attention remained focused on major donors and public perception. Every successful organization develops priorities. Unfortunately, those priorities often expose hidden weaknesses. As the evening continued, the auction preparations entered their final stage. Specialists reviewed bidding procedures. Legal representatives organized transaction documents. Financial officers confirmed sponsorship commitments. Behind the scenes, a separate group worked from the gallery's administrative offices reviewing records connected to future expansion plans. Their task appeared routine. A large donor consortium had recently requested additional information regarding long-term governance and financial structure. The request was expected to produce nothing unusual. Yet one attorney reviewing ownership agreements paused unexpectedly. She noticed a familiar name. At first, she assumed it was coincidence. She reviewed the document again. The name remained. Marcus Reynolds. The attorney frowned. She opened additional files. Ownership entities appeared. Investment records appeared. Historical restructuring agreements appeared. The deeper she examined the documents, the more concerned she became. Across the building, guests prepared for the opening announcement. Nobody knew that a quiet legal review was beginning to raise serious questions. The attorney carried several files to another office. "Can you look at this?" she asked a colleague. Minutes later, 2 attorneys were reviewing the records together. Then 3. The atmosphere slowly changed. Not alarm, not panic, something more cautious. Confusion. One attorney adjusted his glasses. "This cannot be right." Another reviewed the signatures. The records appear legitimate. More documents surfaced. More names connected. More ownership structures traced back to a single source. Outside, Marcus checked the time and continued watching the city lights brighten beyond the gallery. He knew exactly what was happening upstairs. He knew because those records had existed for years. Nobody simply bothered to read them carefully. Inside the gallery, Victoria prepared to address the crowd and begin the auction. She believed the evening was entering its most important phase. In reality, the most important phase had already begun, because somewhere above the exhibition hall, hidden inside legal files that nobody expected to matter, a discovery was quietly moving through the organization. And before the first major bid could be placed, several people inside the gallery would begin realizing that the man they left outside might be the most important person connected to the institution. The auction officially began at 7 o'clock sharp. Applause filled the gallery as guests took their seats beneath the glowing lights of the main exhibition hall. Rows of collectors, investors, museum representatives, and wealthy patrons faced the stage where the evening's most valuable pieces would soon be presented. The atmosphere carried the familiar mixture of prestige and anticipation that surrounded major art events. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of success. Victoria Langford stepped onto the stage with practiced confidence. Her smile reflected years of experience managing high-profile cultural institutions. "Welcome, everyone," she said as the audience settled into silence. "Tonight we celebrate not only remarkable works of art, but the future of this gallery and the community we serve." Applause followed immediately. Victoria continued speaking about artistic excellence, donor support, and the gallery's growing influence. Guests listened attentively. Sponsors nodded with satisfaction. Everything appeared perfectly controlled. Yet behind the scenes, several members of the legal department were no longer paying attention to the presentation. Inside a conference room above the exhibition hall, ownership records covered a large table. Attorneys reviewed documents repeatedly, hoping they had overlooked something. Unfortunately, each review produced the same conclusion. One attorney leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "The structure is legitimate." Another nodded. "Every filing matches." A third attorney pointed toward a series of agreements dating back more than a decade. And the controlling interests ultimately connect to the same individual. Nobody spoke for several moments. The discovery felt increasingly impossible. Downstairs, bidders began competing for the first artwork of the evening. Paddles rose. Numbers climbed. The crowd responded enthusiastically. Every successful sale generated more excitement. Victoria moved comfortably between the stage and audience, completely unaware that her legal team was questioning assumptions that shaped the entire organization. Outside, Marcus Reynolds remained seated near the entrance. Evening had fully settled over the city. Streetlights reflected against the gallery windows. Guests continued arriving. Luxury vehicles continued pulling to the curb. The event looked exactly as it was supposed to look. Marcus watched calmly. He knew the timeline. He knew what the attorneys were finding. More importantly, he knew what would happen once the information reached senior leadership. Organizations often react the same way when confronted by overlooked realities. First comes disbelief, then verification, then concern, then action. The process rarely changes. A young gallery employee stepped outside carrying event programs and noticed Marcus still sitting on the stone bench. This time curiosity overcame caution. "You are still here." Marcus smiled. "Apparently." The employee laughed softly. "Most people would have left hours ago." Marcus looked through the windows toward the auction hall. "I have learned that patience is often more useful than urgency." The employee glanced toward the crowd inside. "You seem very interested in the event." "I am interested in institutions." The employee looked confused. Marcus smiled again. "They reveal themselves when nobody thinks they are being observed." Before the employee could ask another question, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and her expression immediately changed. "I need to go." She hurried back inside. Marcus noticed the urgency. The information was beginning to spread. Upstairs, the legal team finally contacted the gallery's chief financial officer. Within minutes, he joined them in the conference room. The attorneys explained their findings. They presented ownership structures, investment agreements, governance provisions, historical acquisitions. At first, the financial officer rejected the conclusion entirely. Then he reviewed the documents himself. 10 minutes later, he stopped arguing. The evidence was too clear. "Has Victoria seen this?" he asked quietly. One attorney shook her head. "Not yet." The financial officer looked toward the floor below where the auction continued. "She needs to know immediately." Back in the exhibition hall, bidding intensified. Several major pieces sold well above expectations. Guests celebrated record numbers. Reporters updated stories in real time. Sponsors congratulated one another. The evening appeared increasingly successful. Yet a subtle change was beginning to move through the staff. Executives disappeared into private offices. Phone calls multiplied. Managers exchanged concerned looks. The atmosphere remained composed, but tension was quietly spreading beneath the surface. Victoria noticed the change during a break between presentations. One of her senior administrators approached the stage and whispered something into her ear. Victoria frowned immediately. "Now." The administrator nodded. Victoria glanced toward the audience. "Can it wait?" The administrator hesitated. "I do not think so." For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed Victoria's face. She excused herself and followed the administrator toward a private corridor. As they disappeared from view, the auctioneer continued entertaining the crowd. Nobody in the audience noticed anything unusual, but Marcus did. Through the windows, he saw movement inside the executive offices. He checked his watch again. The timing felt about right. Above the exhibition hall, Victoria entered the conference room and immediately noticed the expressions around the table. Nobody looked relaxed. Nobody looked confident. Legal documents covered every available surface. She looked from face to face. "What happened?" The chief financial officer slid a folder toward her. "You need to see this." Victoria opened the file. At first she appeared confused. Then she turned another page. Then another. The room remained silent. Her expression changed slowly as the significance became impossible to ignore. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Langford began realizing that the man denied entry at her front door was connected to the gallery in a way she never imagined. Victoria Langford remained standing beside the conference table as silence settled across the room. The auction continued downstairs. Applause occasionally drifted upward through the building. Bidders competed for paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Guests celebrated record sales. Yet none of that mattered to the people gathered inside the conference room. Their attention remained fixed on the documents spread before them. Victoria turned another page. Then another. Every file seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Historical investment agreements. Ownership entities. Financial restructuring records. Governance provisions. The deeper she read, the less comfortable she became. Finally, she looked up. "Tell me this is incomplete." Nobody answered immediately. The chief financial officer folded his arms. "We checked everything twice." One of the attorneys nodded. "Then we checked it again." Victoria looked back down at the paperwork. The name remained unchanged. Marcus Reynolds. She had never associated the name with the gallery's ownership structure. She knew him as a successful technology executive and investor. She knew he occasionally appeared on lists of influential business leaders. But she had never connected him to the institution she managed. "How much influence does he actually have?" she asked quietly. The senior attorney slid another folder across the table. "More than anyone else." The room fell silent again. Victoria opened the folder and immediately saw why. Voting rights, ownership interests, approval authority, long-term governance protections. The legal language was clear. Several critical decisions could not move forward without his involvement. More importantly, multiple provisions ultimately traced authority back to entities under his control. Victoria slowly lowered the papers. Why was I never informed? The chief financial officer answered carefully. The structure was created years before either of us arrived. Another attorney added, most people assumed the ownership interests were passive. Victoria stared at the documents. Assumed. The word seemed to appear everywhere tonight. Staff assumed Marcus did not belong. Security assumed he was not important. Executives assumed ownership structures no longer mattered. One assumption after another was unraveling. Downstairs, the auction reached another milestone. A major painting sold for a record price. The crowd erupted into applause. Reporters updated headlines. Sponsors smiled proudly. The public image of success remained intact. But upstairs, the foundation beneath that image felt increasingly fragile. Victoria stood and walked toward the conference room window. From above, she could see the main entrance. There, outside the building, Marcus Reynolds still sat calmly on the stone bench. He appeared completely relaxed. No frustration, no urgency, no attempt to force his way inside. Just patience. The sight unsettled her. Most people in his position would have demanded explanations hours ago. Marcus had done the opposite. He waited, almost as if he already knew what would happen. The realization made Victoria uncomfortable. She turned back toward the room. Does he know? Nobody needed clarification. The chief financial officer nodded. I believe so. One attorney added. It would be difficult to imagine otherwise. Victoria looked back toward the entrance. The distance between her office and the stone bench suddenly felt much larger than a few floors. For years, she believed she understood the gallery completely. Tonight, she was discovering how much she never questioned. An assistant entered the room carrying updated auction figures. The evening is going extremely well, she announced before noticing the atmosphere. Her smile disappeared. Is something wrong? Nobody answered immediately. The assistant looked confused and quietly left. The moment the door closed, another attorney entered carrying additional files. There is more. Several people exchanged concerned looks. More was not what anyone wanted to hear. The attorney placed historical correspondence on the table. Letters, investment memorandums, strategic planning documents. Victoria began reviewing them. The pattern quickly emerged. Years earlier, when the gallery faced severe financial difficulties, outside investors stepped forward. Most provided temporary support. One investor provided something more substantial. Long-term stability, capital, protection. The documents repeatedly pointed toward Marcus Reynolds. Not as a passive contributor, as a central figure. Victoria sat down slowly. The room remained quiet while everyone processed the implications. Finally, she asked the question nobody could avoid any longer. Where is he right now? The chief financial officer looked toward the window. Still outside. The answer felt almost surreal. The individual connected to some of the most important decisions in the gallery's history remained sitting on a bench beyond the entrance doors. Unrecognized. Uninvited. Ignored. Victoria closed the final folder and stared at the table. For years, she had focused on public perception, donor relationships, sponsorships, and prestige. Yet tonight, the most important person connected to the institution had been treated like a stranger. The realization settled heavily across the room. Downstairs, applause erupted once again as another successful bid concluded. Upstairs, nobody reacted. The auction no longer felt like the center of the evening. A different story had taken control of the night. Victoria stood, straightened her jacket, and looked around the room. Give me every document connected to his investments. She paused before adding one final instruction. And prepare a complete ownership summary. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. As attorneys rushed to gather records, Victoria turned toward the door. Because for the first time all evening, she understood that before another painting was sold, she needed to speak with the man everyone else had left waiting outside. Victoria Langford moved quickly through the executive corridor while the sounds of the auction echoed faintly through the walls behind her. For years, she had managed crises, negotiated with donors, and navigated difficult financial situations. Yet nothing in her experience prepared her for the realization unfolding inside the gallery tonight. Every document she reviewed pointed toward the same conclusion. Marcus Reynolds was not simply connected to the institution. He occupied a position far more important than anyone currently leading it understood. As she reached the executive office suite, attorneys continued gathering records from archives and digital databases. Folders appeared on conference tables. Historical reports surfaced. Old correspondence was retrieved from storage systems that had not been accessed in years. The deeper they searched, the clearer the picture became. One attorney organized the findings into a timeline stretching back more than a decade. Victoria stopped beside the display and studied it carefully. The story emerging from the records felt almost impossible. Years earlier, the gallery had faced a severe financial crisis. Attendance had fallen. Donations declined. Several major sponsors withdrew support. Internal reports described an organization struggling to survive. Some board members even considered selling portions of the collection to remain operational. Then everything changed. A series of investment entities began providing capital. Strategic financing stabilized operations. Long-term debt was restructured. Expansion projects resumed. Public confidence returned. Over time, the crisis faded into memory. New leadership arrived. New board members joined. The institution moved forward. Most people assumed the recovery happened naturally. The documents revealed a different reality. Marcus Reynolds stood behind much of it. Victoria slowly sat down. "Why was this never discussed?" she asked quietly. One of the attorneys pointed toward the original agreements. "Because he never asked for public recognition." Another attorney nodded. His involvement remained largely invisible by design. The answer surprised everyone. Most investors sought influence, publicity, or status. Marcus apparently wanted none of those things. Instead, he remained in the background while the gallery rebuilt itself. Victoria reviewed another file. Internal correspondence repeatedly described the importance of protecting the institution's future. Long-term sustainability, community access, cultural preservation. The language appeared consistently throughout years of planning documents connected to Marcus's investments. What surprised Victoria most was the absence of ego. The records did not read like someone pursuing control. They read like someone protecting an asset he believed mattered. Downstairs, the auction continued generating headlines. Record sales attracted media attention. Reporters published updates. Guests celebrated successful acquisitions. Yet the gallery's leadership had stopped focusing on artwork entirely. The true story of the evening now existed upstairs among ownership records and forgotten agreements. Victoria stood and walked toward the window overlooking the entrance. Marcus remained seated outside exactly where security left him. The sight felt increasingly uncomfortable. She imagined what the evening looked like from his perspective. He arrived. He was denied entry. Nobody verified his identity. Nobody questioned assumptions. Nobody offered assistance. Then the organization spent hours discovering who he really was. The irony was difficult to ignore. An institution dedicated to recognizing value had completely failed to recognize the most important person connected to it. Back in the conference room, another attorney entered carrying additional files. "We found the governance provisions." Everyone looked up immediately. The attorney placed several documents on the table. "These are the ones that matter." Silence filled the room as pages were distributed. Victoria reviewed the language carefully. Certain decisions required approval. Certain actions required consultation. Certain structural changes depended on ownership interests that ultimately traced back to Marcus Reynolds. Then she reached a section that caused her to stop reading entirely. "Wait." The room looked toward her. Victoria pointed at a paragraph highlighted by the legal team. "This cannot be correct." The senior attorney answered carefully. "It is correct." Victoria read the language again. Then a third time. The meaning never changed. Under specific circumstances, Marcus possessed authority extending far beyond ordinary investment oversight. Significant authority. Transformational authority. The room fell silent. One board member finally spoke. "Does he know about these provisions?" Several attorneys exchanged looks before answering. "He signed them." Nobody said another word. Outside, Marcus glanced at his watch once more. He knew enough time had passed for the discovery process to reach its final stage. The attorneys would have found the ownership records first, then the governance agreements, then the approval rights. Every step followed a predictable sequence. The only variable was how leadership would react once they understood the complete picture. Inside, Victoria closed the final folder and took a slow breath. Earlier that evening, she viewed Marcus as an absent guest whose name happened to be missing from a list. Now she understood that perspective belonged to a different world. The reality was far more significant. She looked toward the conference room door. Bring him inside. Nobody moved immediately. The instruction carried unusual weight. Victoria repeated it. Right now. This time the chief financial officer nodded and headed toward the elevator. As the door closed behind him, the room remained silent. Every person present understood that the next conversation could determine the future of the gallery itself. And for the first time all evening, the people who controlled the auction were preparing to meet the man who controlled far more than they ever imagined. The chief financial officer found Marcus Reynolds exactly where everyone expected him to be. He remained seated on the stone bench outside the gallery entrance, watching the city lights reflect across the glass facade. Guests continued arriving. Luxury vehicles continued pulling to the curb. The auction continued inside. To anyone passing by, Marcus looked like a patient observer enjoying a quiet evening. Nothing about his appearance suggested that an entire executive team was now searching for him. The financial officer approached carefully. Mr. Reynolds? Marcus looked up and smiled politely. Good evening. The executive hesitated for a moment. Earlier that night, security staff barely acknowledged Marcus. Now one of the most senior officers in the organization stood before him with visible concern. Victoria Langford would like to speak with you. Marcus glanced toward the entrance. I see. The executive nodded. As soon as possible. Marcus stood slowly and adjusted his jacket. There was no sign of triumph. No indication that he enjoyed the situation. If anything, he seemed unsurprised. The financial officer found that detail unsettling. Most people would have reacted emotionally after being denied entry. Marcus appeared completely calm. As they walked toward the entrance, security personnel immediately stepped aside. The same doors that remained closed earlier now opened without hesitation. Staff members noticed the change immediately. Conversations paused. Employees exchanged confused looks. Something important was clearly happening. Marcus entered the gallery for the first time that evening. The main exhibition hall remained filled with guests and active bidding. Paintings continued changing hands. Reporters continued gathering quotes. Yet a subtle shift moved through the staff. Word traveled quickly inside institutions. Not facts, not complete explanations, just awareness that something significant had happened. Marcus followed the financial officer toward the executive level. Along the way, several employees looked at him with growing curiosity. Some recognized his name from business magazines. Others simply sensed that his presence mattered. None understood the full story. Upstairs, the conference room fell silent the moment Marcus entered. Every person present stood. Attorneys, executives, board representatives. Victoria Langford remained near the head of the table. For several seconds nobody spoke. Marcus looked around the room calmly before taking a seat. The same room that spent hours reviewing his records now waited for him to speak. Victoria finally broke the silence. Mr. Reynolds, thank you for meeting with us. Marcus smiled slightly. I was nearby. A few nervous expressions appeared around the table. The response was polite but impossible to ignore. Everyone understood what he meant. Victoria took a slow breath. First, I owe you an apology. Marcus listened without interruption. You should have been welcome this evening. The situation at the entrance should never have happened. Marcus nodded. I appreciate that. Victoria waited for more. None came. No criticism. No lecture. No anger. The absence of hostility somehow made the moment more uncomfortable. One attorney shifted in his chair. Another reviewed documents unnecessarily. Marcus remained composed. Victoria continued. We have spent the last several hours reviewing historical ownership records. Marcus nodded again. I assumed you would. The statement produced another moment of silence. Because once again, he sounded completely unsurprised. Victoria folded her hands. There are aspects of the gallery's structure that many of us did not fully understand. Marcus looked around the room. That appears to be true. Nobody challenged the observation. The evidence sitting on the table made denial impossible. Victoria glanced toward the ownership files. Why remain silent? Marcus considered the question. About which part? Your involvement. Marcus looked through the conference room window toward the exhibition hall below. Guests continued celebrating art, prestige, and success. Because recognition was never the objective. Several people exchanged looks. Marcus continued. When I became involved years ago, the gallery needed stability. He paused briefly. Not another personality. The room remained silent. His answer explained more than anyone expected. Many investors wanted influence, public credit, visibility. Marcus apparently wanted results. Victoria slowly nodded. The explanation fit everything the records revealed. One board representative leaned forward. You could have announced who you were at the entrance. Marcus smiled. Of course. Then why did you not? Marcus looked directly at him. Because I wanted to see what happened. The answer landed heavily. Nobody needed further explanation. Every assumption made throughout the evening suddenly returned to the room. Security assumptions, staff assumptions, leadership assumptions. Marcus continued calmly. Organizations reveal themselves when nobody believes they are being evaluated. Complete silence followed. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. The observation felt accurate in a way that made defense impossible. The gallery spent years promoting art, culture, and recognition of value. Yet tonight it failed to recognize value, standing directly outside its own doors. Marcus looked around the room one final time. No anger appeared in his expression. No satisfaction. Just clarity. The attorneys had found the records. The executives understood the ownership structure. The truth was now visible to everyone. What mattered next was not the mistake. It was what happened after the mistake. And as the auction continued below and the city lights shimmered beyond the windows, every person in the room sensed that the conversation was about to move beyond apologies and towards something far more consequential, the future of the gallery itself. The conference room remained quiet after Marcus Reynolds finished speaking. Outside the windows, the city glowed beneath the night sky. Below them, the auction continued attracting attention, generating headlines, and producing record sales. Yet inside the executive offices, nobody seemed interested in the auction anymore. The paintings, the bidders, the applause, all of it suddenly felt secondary to the conversation unfolding around the conference table. Victoria Langford looked at Marcus carefully. The more she reviewed the records and listened to his answers, the more one question continued returning to her mind. Finally, she asked it. Why did you invest in the gallery in the first place? The room became still. Several executives leaned forward. Attorneys stopped reviewing documents. Even the chief financial officer looked curious. It was the question nobody had asked during all the years Marcus remained involved with the institution. Marcus looked toward the exhibition hall below. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. Because of my mother. The answer surprised everyone. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Marcus folded his hands and continued. When I was 12 years old, my mother worked 2 jobs. The room listened carefully. She was not wealthy. She did not have connections. But every month, she found time to take me somewhere that changed how I viewed the world. Marcus looked through the glass toward the artwork displayed below. Museums, galleries, public exhibitions. His voice remained calm, but something softer appeared beneath the words. She believed exposure to great ideas mattered. Nobody interrupted. Marcus continued. We could not afford many things, but she always found ways to expose me to culture, creativity, and possibility. He smiled slightly at the memory. She used to tell me that art expands the size of your future before your future actually arrives. Several people exchanged thoughtful looks. The sentence felt simple yet powerful. Marcus continued. Some of the places we visited no longer exist. Others became inaccessible to ordinary families. He paused briefly. Over time, I noticed a pattern. Victoria listened carefully. Marcus looked around the room. Institutions created to inspire people gradually began focusing on exclusivity instead. Silence followed. Nobody disagreed. The observation felt difficult to challenge. Marcus continued. Art should elevate communities. He gestured toward the gallery below. Not separate them. The room remained quiet. Years of reports, budgets, donor programs, and fundraising campaigns suddenly seemed less important than the principle Marcus described. One executive finally asked, So you invested to preserve access? Marcus nodded. Among other reasons. He stood and slowly walked toward the conference room window. Below, guests admired artwork beneath elegant lighting. The gallery mattered. He looked back toward the table. It still matters. Victoria frowned slightly. Then why do these documents give you such extensive authority? Marcus smiled. Because when the gallery was struggling, nobody else wanted responsibility. The answer immediately changed the atmosphere. The room remembered the records. Financial crisis. Declining attendance. Uncertain future. Marcus continued. People were willing to support success. Another pause. Few were willing to support survival. Nobody spoke. The truth carried weight. Marcus returned to the table. I agreed to provide capital because I believed the institution deserved a future. He glanced toward the ownership documents. The governance provisions were not designed to give me power. He tapped the folder lightly. They were designed to protect purpose. Several attorneys nodded. Looking at the agreements through that lens suddenly made them easier to understand. Marcus had never built safeguards around himself. He built safeguards around an idea. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. The realization felt increasingly uncomfortable. Earlier that evening, staff judged Marcus based on appearance. Security judged him based on a guest list. Leadership judged him based on assumptions. Yet the records told a completely different story. The person sitting across from them had spent years protecting the gallery while asking for almost nothing in return. Marcus looked toward the artwork visible through the glass walls. Do you know what disappointed me tonight? The question caught everyone off guard. Victoria answered quietly. Being denied entry? Marcus shook his head. No. The room fell silent. Marcus continued. That was not the problem. He looked around the table. The problem was how quickly people accepted it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The observation landed harder than any criticism could have. Marcus continued. Nobody asked questions. Nobody verified assumptions. Nobody wondered whether they might be mistaken. His voice remained calm. That is not a security issue. That is a cultural issue. Victoria slowly nodded. She understood. Because he was right. The mistake at the entrance was not one person's error. It reflected something deeper. A pattern. A mindset. A habit of evaluating people before understanding them. Marcus looked toward the city lights beyond the gallery. Institutions survive because they remain connected to their purpose. He paused. The moment they become more interested in appearances than purpose, decline begins. The room remained completely silent. Every person present understood that the conversation was no longer about a denied guest. It was about the identity of the gallery itself. Marcus sat back down and folded his hands. The records had revealed his authority. The evening had revealed the institution. And as the executives looked around the room, many began realizing that the most important decision facing the gallery was not about ownership. It was about whether the organization still remembered why it existed in the first place. The conference room remained silent long after Marcus Reynolds finished speaking. No one rushed to respond. No one attempted to defend the gallery's decisions. The truth sitting between them was too clear. For years, the institution had celebrated its mission publicly while gradually drifting away from the principles that originally justified its existence. Victoria Langford looked down at the collection of reports covering the table. Attendance records, membership statistics, sponsorship summaries, strategic plans. For the first time, she viewed them through a different lens. The numbers appeared strong. Donations had increased. Exclusive memberships expanded. Prestige grew. Yet another pattern now stood beside those achievements. Community participation had steadily declined. Educational access programs received less attention. Public outreach initiatives became smaller portions of annual budgets. The gallery had become successful by traditional measures while quietly narrowing the audience it was supposed to serve. Marcus observed the room carefully. He was not interested in assigning blame. Blame rarely solved institutional problems. Understanding did. Growth did. Accountability did. Across the table, the chief financial officer finally spoke. If we are being honest, many of these changes happened gradually. Marcus nodded. Most important changes do. The executive continued. No single decision seemed harmful at the time. That is usually how mission drift works, Marcus replied. It arrives one reasonable decision at a time. Several people lowered their eyes. The statement felt painfully accurate. Every adjustment had appeared logical. Every compromise appeared temporary. Every shift seemed justified by financial realities. Yet the cumulative effect was impossible to ignore. Victoria took a slow breath. What happens now? The question carried unusual weight. Not because nobody knew the legal answer. The legal answer sat inside the governance documents. The real uncertainty involved what Marcus intended to do with the authority he possessed. For several moments he remained quiet. Then he stood and walked toward the window overlooking the exhibition hall. Another successful sale had just concluded. Guests applauded. Cameras flashed. Reporters continued documenting the evening's accomplishments. From a distance, everything appeared prosperous. Marcus looked at the crowd below before speaking. The gallery in its current form has reached the end of its purpose. The room became perfectly still. Nobody interrupted. Marcus continued calmly. Not because art failed. Not because the staff failed. Because the institution gradually became something different from what it was meant to be. Victoria listened carefully. Marcus turned back toward the table. Years ago, I invested to protect public access to art. He paused. Tonight demonstrated that access is no longer the priority. One board representative shifted uncomfortably. Are you saying the gallery should close? Marcus shook his head. No. Relief briefly appeared on several faces. Then Marcus continued. I am saying the current structure should end. The relief disappeared immediately. Marcus returned to the table and opened one of the governance files. The ownership provisions allow for dissolution and restructuring under specific circumstances. Several attorneys nodded. They already knew the language. Marcus looked around the room. I intend to exercise that authority. Silence followed. Outside the conference room, the auction continued. Inside, the future of the institution changed course. Victoria remained composed despite the magnitude of the announcement. What replaces it? She asked. Marcus smiled slightly. For the first time that evening, genuine optimism appeared in his expression. Something closer to the original mission. He opened another folder containing preliminary planning documents. Several executives looked surprised. The plans were detailed, thoughtful, comprehensive. Marcus had clearly spent years considering possibilities. Community exhibition spaces, educational partnerships, free admission programs, artist development initiatives, regional outreach centers, mobile exhibitions designed to reach neighborhoods that rarely interacted with traditional cultural institutions. The room reviewed the materials with growing astonishment. This was not an emotional reaction to a bad evening. This was a vision, a long-term strategy, a completely different model. Victoria studied the proposals carefully. The more she read, the more she understood. Marcus was not trying to destroy the gallery. He was trying to release it from the version it had become. The distinction mattered a great deal. One attorney finally broke the silence. The transition would require liquidation of the current organization. Marcus nodded. Correct. The chief financial officer added. Assets would need to be redistributed according to the restructuring plan. Correct. Another executive looked up. This would be one of the most significant cultural reorganizations in the city. Marcus smiled softly. Then perhaps it is overdue. The room fell silent once more. Downstairs, guests continued celebrating the success of the auction without realizing that the institution hosting it was approaching a historic turning point. Victoria looked through the proposals one final time before raising her eyes toward Marcus. Hours earlier, she viewed him as a guest who could not enter the building. Now she understood that he had arrived carrying the future of the entire organization. And as the sounds of the auction echoed faintly through the gallery, everyone in the room realized that by the end of the night, the institution they thought they understood would no longer exist in the same form again. The auction ended later that evening beneath the same bright lights that had welcomed hundreds of guests into the gallery. Applause filled the hall one final time as the last artwork was sold. Reporters gathered closing statements. Sponsors celebrated successful bids. Visitors discussed memorable pieces and record numbers. Most of them had no idea that upstairs, a decision had already been made that would redefine the future of the institution itself. In the weeks that followed, news of the restructuring spread throughout the city. Headlines focused on the unexpected announcement. Industry experts debated the implications. Cultural organizations studied the details. Some people expressed surprise. Others expressed concern. Many simply wanted to understand why an institution with such prestige would voluntarily abandon its existing structure. Marcus Reynolds never responded publicly to the speculation. Instead, he allowed the plan to speak for itself. The gallery's assets were carefully evaluated. Collections were preserved. Historical works remained protected. Staff members were offered opportunities within the new organization. Every decision followed a single principle. The mission would survive even if the structure changed. Victoria Langford remained deeply involved throughout the transition. At first, she expected resentment. She expected criticism. Instead, she discovered something unexpected. The restructuring process forced difficult conversations that should have happened years earlier. Questions about access. Questions about purpose. Questions about who art was meant to serve. As those conversations expanded, support for the new vision grew. 6 months later, the first community art center opened in a neighborhood that had never hosted a major cultural institution. Families attended free exhibitions. Students participated in educational programs. Local artists gained opportunities to display their work. Attendance exceeded every projection. Soon another center opened. Then another. Mobile exhibitions traveled throughout the region. Partnerships with schools expanded dramatically. Programs once considered secondary became central priorities. Marcus visited several of the locations quietly. He preferred observing rather than speaking. During one visit, he watched a group of middle school students standing in front of a large painting. Their teacher encouraged them to describe what they saw. The answers varied. Creativity filled the room. Curiosity filled the room. Possibility filled the room. Marcus smiled because the scene reminded him of his mother. Years earlier, she had given him access to ideas larger than his circumstances. Now thousands of other young people were receiving the same opportunity. One afternoon, Victoria joined him at the original gallery building. The structure still stood, though it now operated under a completely different model. Large portions of the space were dedicated to public programming. Admission barriers had been removed. Educational events occurred daily. The atmosphere felt transformed. They stood near the entrance where everything began. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria smiled. "I still think about that night." Marcus looked toward the doors. "So do I." Victoria shook her head softly. "It is strange how a few minutes can expose years of assumptions." Marcus nodded. That is usually how change begins. Visitors continued entering the building around them. Families, students, artists, retirees, people from every part of the city. Nobody asked whether they belonged. Nobody questioned whether they looked important enough. They simply entered. Victoria watched the crowd and smiled. "You never seemed angry." Marcus considered the observation carefully. Anger would not have improved the outcome. He paused. Understanding might. Victoria nodded. Over time, she had come to appreciate that distinction. The most powerful response to a flawed system was not revenge. It was transformation. The original organization no longer existed in the form she once managed. Yet its purpose had become stronger than ever. Later that evening, Marcus remained near the entrance after everyone else had left. The city lights reflected across the glass exactly as they had months earlier. The same streets, the same skyline, the same building. Yet everything felt different. He remembered sitting alone on the stone bench outside. He remembered the assumptions, the silence, the closed doors. Looking back, those moments no longer seemed important. What mattered was what followed. Institutions could make mistakes. People could make mistakes. The real question was whether they learned from them. Marcus looked through the entrance at the activity continuing inside. Children explored exhibits. Volunteers welcomed visitors. Artists prepared new installations. The building felt alive in a way that numbers alone could never measure. A place once defined by exclusivity had become a place defined by opportunity. Marcus smiled and turned toward the city. Years earlier, his mother told him that art expands the size of a person's future before the future arrives. Standing there beneath the evening lights, watching a new generation discover possibilities they had never imagined, he realized she had been right all along.